Georgina sat in the quiet room, staring out the window. The sun had just begun to set, casting long shadows across the room. She could feel the coolness of the evening creeping in through the open window, but it didn't matter. She had grown used to the chill in the air. It wasn't the cold from outside that bothered her anymore, it was the emptiness inside. Her hands rested gently on the edge of the windowsill, the place where she and Michael had spent countless evenings together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, sharing soft words and stolen glances. The memory of those moments had become a bittersweet comfort. The laughter, the warmth of his touch, the way his eyes had looked at her with love, those were the moments she clung to now, moments that seemed so distant, yet so painfully close. Michael had been everything to her. They had met years ago, at a time when Georgina thought she had everything figured out. She was young and full of dreams, but Michael's presence had changed all of that. His quiet strength, his deep kindness, and the way he loved her made her feel like she could conquer the world. They had shared so much, a love so pure, so effortless, that it felt like the universe had aligned just for them. But that was before the day when life, in all its cruel uncertainty, took him away from her. It had been a slow burn. At first, it was small things, his occasional cough, the way he seemed more tired than usual. She had noticed the changes but never thought much of it. She told herself that everyone has bad days, that everything would be fine in the end. But then the doctor's visits became more frequent, and the diagnoses more serious. The disease had taken hold of him in ways they hadn't expected, stealing his strength and leaving him a shadow of the man she had fallen in love with. She remembered the day he had looked at her with those tired eyes, the sparkle in them dimmed by the pain he was enduring. "Georgina," he had said softly, his voice barely a whisper, "I don't want you to watch me fade away." Tears had welled up in her eyes, but she had held them back. "You won't fade away, Michael. You'll never fade away. I'll always be here for you." He had smiled at her then, though it was a sad, knowing smile. She could see the love in his eyes, the strength of his heart, but she could also see the resignation. He knew, just as she did, that the end was coming. In the months that followed, Georgina had been by his side every moment she could. She held his hand, whispered words of comfort, and did everything she could to make his final days peaceful. There had been moments of quiet tenderness, those moments when she could still see the man she loved behind the sickness. They would talk about old memories, about the dreams they had once shared. They spoke of a future that would never come, and yet, even in those moments, there was love. But eventually, even love could not save him. Michael's death was a crushing blow that Georgina had never fully prepared for. The pain was like a constant ache in her chest, a weight that pressed down on her with every breath she took. He was gone, and no amount of wishing or hoping could bring him back. In the days and weeks that followed, Georgina wandered through her life in a fog. She went through the motions, but nothing felt real. She would wake up in the morning, make her coffee, and sit at the kitchen table, but everything felt empty. His absence was a hole in her life that could never be filled. She found herself staring at the places where he used to sit, touching the things he had touched, and feeling the ghost of his presence in every corner of their home. The silence was the hardest part. The absence of his voice, his laughter, his warmth, it was a silence that consumed her. Sometimes, she would find herself calling out his name, as if he were still there, as if her voice could somehow bring him back. But there was no answer, only the echo of her own voice, bouncing back at her from the empty walls. At night, she would lie in bed, her arms stretched across the empty space where he used to sleep. She would close her eyes and imagine him next to her, holding her, telling her that everything would be okay. But when she opened her eyes, the bed was still empty, and the only thing she could feel was the coldness of the sheets. Georgina tried to move on, to find some way to heal, but the grief never truly left her. She would visit the places they had once loved, parks, cafes, even the little bookstore where they had spent hours together, talking about books and life and love. But now, those places only reminded her of what she had lost. They were haunted by memories, memories that both comforted and tortured her. There were times when she would stand in front of the mirror and wonder if she would ever feel whole again. She had given so much of herself to Michael, and now that he was gone, she wasn't sure who she was without him. The love they had shared had been everything to her, and without it, she felt lost. But even in the depths of her sorrow, Georgina knew that there was something she could hold on to, the love they had shared. It was something that no one could take away from her. It was a part of her now, woven into the very fabric of her being. She could still feel it, like a warm ember deep inside her heart, flickering in the darkness. And so, despite the pain, despite the emptiness, she carried on. She went to work, she met with friends, she tried to live her life. But the truth was, she was only going through the motions. The real Georgina was the one who still carried Michael's memory in her heart, the one who would never forget the love they had shared. There were days when she would sit in the quiet of her room, tears silently streaming down her face, and she would imagine that Michael was still with her. She would close her eyes and remember the way his embrace had felt, the way his arms had wrapped around her, holding her close, as if he could protect her from the world. It was in those moments that she felt his love the most, not in the grand gestures, but in the quiet, tender moments that had defined their relationship. And then, there were the nights when she would stand by the window, just as she had years ago, watching the sun set and waiting for the stars to appear. The world still turned, time still moved forward, but it felt like everything had stopped for her. The love she had known, the love that had defined her, was no longer a living thing. It was a memory, a shadow that she would carry with her always. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of the city, the hum of life continuing on. People were still living, still moving forward, but for Georgina, everything had changed. Michael was gone, and no matter how hard she tried, she could not find a way to let go. The love they had shared was something she could never forget, something that would live on in her heart forever. And so, she embraced the ache, the longing, the quiet moments of sorrow. It was all she had left of him. The world had taken Michael away, but it could never take away the love they had shared. That love, in all its beauty and pain, would live on in her, long after the embers had faded. And maybe, just maybe, in the quietest moments of her grief, she would still feel his presence, like a whisper in the wind, a soft touch on her cheek, a reminder that even in loss, love never truly disappears. It was in the fading embers of her heart that Georgina found solace. She had loved, and she would continue to love, in the way that only those who have lost can understand. Love was a powerful force, one that could transcend time and space, one that could never be extinguished. And so, as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, Georgina closed her eyes and whispered into the wind, "I love you, Michael." She wasn't sure if he could hear her, but in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the love they had shared would remain, forever burning, even in the darkest of nights.